Welcome to Humanity in Deep Space, an initiative involving a planetary conversation surrounding the range of interconnected issues and hard challenges ranging from science to health, food, design, economics, governance, space and planetary ethics, etc., that must be addressed as our species continues to transition to deep space. This is episode 13, Humankind and Responsible Space Exploration. Our continued exploration of space is accompanied by profound questions, responsibilities, and obligations. What is our place and ultimate responsibility to the larger universe? Are we just fleeting visitors, or do we become custodians of the celestial bodies we explore? Given human nature, are we capable of getting this right? And what is the appropriate response to finding, however primitive, life in space? Today's guests are Dr. Graham Lau, an astrobiologist and communicator of science. Dr. Lau serves as the Director of Communications and Marketing for Blue Marble Space and as the Director of Logistics for the University Rover Challenge. He's also the host of the NASA-funded show Ask an Astrobiologist. And Greg Schmidt, who serves as Director of the Solar System Exploration Research Virtual Institute, located in the NASA Research Park at Ames Research Center. Greg was co-founder of the NASA Ames Space Portal, an organization which promotes activities in entrepreneurial space, and was one of the core team that developed the science of astrobiology in the late 1990s. And Kelly Smith, professor of both philosophy and biological sciences, as well as chair of the Department of Philosophy and Religion at Clemson University. His research is highly interdisciplinary and includes work on the concept of genetic disease, the relationship between religious faith and scientific reasoning, the ethical implications of technology, and social and conceptual issues in astrobiology and space exploration. Our moderator and the founder of Humanity in Deep Space is Kris Kimel. Kris has launched numerous entrepreneurial enterprises and is the co-founder of the commercial space company Space Tango.
Hello, my name is Kris Kimel with Humanity in Deep Space. I want to welcome all of our guests here today. I'm glad that everybody's been able to join us for this, but I'm sure it's going to be a really interesting conversation about humankind and our exploration of space and how we're going to deal with a lot of these different issues. I want to also welcome the people have registered. We have almost 25 countries represented as well, so that's very good because we always want these to be a planetary conversation. And I welcome all of those from around the world who are also going to be joining us today. First of all, I want to thank the sponsors that make Humanity in Deep Space possible. Our lead sponsor is Space 629. Then we have SSERVI, the Space System Exploration Institute at NASA, headed by Greg Schmidt, who's on our call today. Kentucky Science Technology Corporation, the National Stem Cell Foundation, headed by Paula Grisanti, and they're also doing some really interesting work in space, looking at Parkinson's and MS and other kinds of things. The Sjogren Center, Baird Financial Services, Space Tango, Media Collaboratory, the START program at the University of Kentucky, held by Luke Bradley. It's a STEM program. Higher Orbits, the Interstellar Foundation, Visit Lex, and also 22 Solutions. So I want to thank all of them for making this all possible. Again, Humanity in Deep Space, for those of you joining us for the first time, is a nonprofit enterprise basically geared toward talking about and exploring a lot of the issues regarding humans leaving the neighborhood and moving into deep space. For purposes of our conversation, we include the moon on that, but also looking at deeper space and Mars and some of the other things, and just talking about the various issues that are really hard problems that we need to solve. Like all of our conversations, this is not about right or wrong answers. We're not going to reach conclusions. We're not trying to come up and say, oh yeah, this is what we need to do. It really is about bringing up the conversation and introducing these ideas to a broader audience, and also recognizing that ideas come from everywhere. And hopefully people that hear these kinds of things may have ideas that they can contribute, because to do this, properly, for us to really become a spacefaring civilization, which we already are, is going to take the input of every discipline and lots sorts of knowledge. And so that's part of what we want to do. So as we go through, feel free, those of you who can use the chat format to go ahead and ask questions, and we'll get to those after we talk for a few minutes. But feel free to please ask questions, and we'll try to get to those, as many of those as we can. So let me start out by just asking each person to introduce themselves very briefly. Kelly.
Oh, okay. I'm Kelly Smith. I'm an evolutionary biologist and philosopher of science, and I run the Department of Philosophy and Religion at Clemson University.
Thank you. And Greg.
I'm Greg Schmidt. I'm Director of Solar System Exploration Research Virtual Institute, which is a NASA-based organization, and we focus on research at the intersection of science and human exploration.
Thanks. And Graham?
Yeah, hi all. I'm Graham Lau. I'm the Director of Communications and Marketing for Blue Marble Space, a research investigator with Blue Marble Space Institute of Science, and many know me as the host of the NASA-funded show Ask an Astrobiologist.
Great. Thank all three of you for being here. I appreciate your time. So let's just jump in by talking about, what do we mean by responsible space? I mean, what does that mean to you? We're moving off the planet, both as humans and also robotically, which are simply extensions of us as humans. And so when people talk about doing this in a responsible way, what is that? How does that speak to you? What do you think about? Who wants to start? Graham, how about you?
Sure. I think the very concept of doing space or doing any current human endeavor responsibly is an acknowledgement of our past, our shared human past on this planet, and the fact that we've done many things. We've had various endeavors that have not been done responsibly. We've gone to new lands and entirely disrespected the peoples who already inhabited those lands, enslaving them, bringing diseases to them, not thinking about our actions and our behaviors and how it impacted those other peoples. Through time, we've done things in a way, our ancestors have done things in a way that hasn't always honored the land that they were on, that they came from, nor the places they were going to, not just people, but also resources. And so when it comes to exploring space responsibly and to building our future right now on Earth responsibly, I think a lot of it comes from this environmentalist movement, kind of the early days of space exploration, seeing our Earth from space, both humans having that experience, but also having pictures come back to Earth and having Earthrise and having the blue marble image, seeing that we are part of a biosphere, a fragile little wisp of material on the outside of this rock floating in the void altogether. That recognition, I think, has been enough to drive a lot of us now to realize that moving forward, we need to think more about how we honor the place we come from and how we honor the places we're going to.
Okay. Kelly, let you go next.
Well, I mean, I think you got to keep in mind that the stuff we're doing in space right now, we've never done before, and it's extremely difficult. And that means that there's going to be all kinds of situations that we can't perfectly predict. I tend to be a bit of an optimist in general about technology and the humanities' future and all that kind of stuff. I think the appropriate thing to look for at this point is to try to get a balance of people who have serious concerns and people that really want to do this because they think it's amazingly cool, and then really foster the kind of conversations that will help us as best we can sort of anticipate what the problems are and try to head off the worst ones without shutting down the whole project. So, I mean, in a lot of cases, people tend to just gravitate to one of the two extremes. You get the people that say, we shouldn't be going into space at all until we solve every problem on Earth.
Right.
You get the people that say, we should let all private companies do whatever they want to in space. Those are both wrong. But there's a lot of ground in the middle, and trying to figure out where the right middle ground is complicated. And part of what I want to do is just try to get a more diverse group of people, in particular people that aren't in STEM already, who maybe have expertise in sociology and ethics and these kinds of things, get them involved in these conversations because their perspectives are important.
Greg?
Yeah, I would echo certainly what both Kelly and Graham have said. Those are extremely important points, and points that I think about a lot. I mean, we have to, I think it's been a really healthy thing for us to reflect on the era of colonialism, which, started hundreds of years ago, and a lot of people suffered. And we don't want to bring these same tenets forward when we move forward with space exploration. Another thing that I think about is, and talk about a lot, is how different our era is now than in the 60s when I was growing up, and when I watched Apollo and Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin walk on the lunar surface and everything. Right now, my institute, for instance, is partnered with 11 different countries, and we have several more on the drawing board. The world is going to space. Mexico, for instance, one of our future partners, has a rover that's going to be on one of the commercial landers. I think this is a wonderful thing, and so you mentioned, Kris, about the nearly 25 countries that joined. Your countries, for those of you not in the United States, are participating in this great venture. I think this is a really good thing. One of the things that I think about, and there's been news this very week that Graham no doubt will want to talk about, which I think makes the likelihood of life, even in our own solar system, that much greater. I gave a talk years ago reflecting on the Drake equation. Kris was at the IDEA Festival, and how much progress we had made since Frank Drake first identified this equation. And but that was 20 years ago. There's been a huge amount of progress since then, and all the stars we found. Basically, my prediction is that we are in a galaxy that is going to be teeming with life. And so we need to move forward in a very conscious way, and we need to treat this life, be it intelligent life or be it microbial life, with the respect that it deserves.
I want to get to some of those issues regarding life in a second, but I want to back up a little bit when we talk about responsible space as well. What about some of the issues that are involved in a more immediate kind of nature that we're already dealing with, environmental issues and access issues and things of that nature, that I think sometimes when we talk about responsible space, people maybe don't tend to think about some of those things, but there are big issues related to responsible space for space, but also space, solar system / Earth. So let me throw that out and let you respond to some of the issues there.
Yeah, I'll jump in first if you don't mind there. And there's so many different topics we could talk about there.
That's
I think
fine.
one crucial thing that I really want people to understand, because I feel like we don't talk about this often enough, that there is this huge movement of like the environmentalist movement, this movement towards caring for the planet. A lot of us who've done space exploration stuff, who've been in the industry or in government, we hear that phrase all the time, like, why do we waste money on space when we have problems here? It's almost a constant phrase you hear anywhere you go and you give talks about space and all these things that we do. And it's so important that people understand how much it's given back to the Earth from exploring space. And I could go down a list of all the spin-off technologies and stuff that we've had. But one of the most important things for people right now who do care about what's happening to our planet, who are aware that there is very good scientific data, very good interpretations on those data to support that humans are driving rapid climate change on our planet right now. We see those effects in our atmosphere, on the surface of the oceans. We see it across the land right now, and we're seeing it in the intensification and variability of storms across the planet, very crazy weather we've had, drying cycles, all kinds of things. A lot of that knowledge comes from space exploration. If we had just sat on our hands and had never traveled out into the void, we might not have had those early data of the atmosphere of Mars kind of being almost barren, it appears, at the surface, and having a very light atmosphere, the atmosphere of Venus, this hot planet, with a very thick atmosphere, super high pressure at the surface. But then also like looking back at our own world and seeing these changes occurring from space. We have the Keeling curve, this change in CO2 over time in our atmosphere. We can monitor in the atmosphere from the surface of the planet, but it really is Earth observation satellites that have given us the most data that are now allowing us to track these changes in our climate, changes in weather patterns, changes across the world.
Okay.
Yeah, I'd like to I really echo that. This is a huge thing for me personally. I will say that my wife is an earth scientist. We always like to say that I look up and she looks down, and they're both important. But I always tell her what she does. What I do is important. What she does is vital, and so. And I think, Graham, you made a really important point about the intersection of planetary science with earth science, and the gentleman Jim Hansen, who developed the first theories, about climate change a long time ago, about 30 or so years ago. He was a planetary scientist. I once talked with him about this, studying Venus. And he had the idea, wow, I wonder if the same thing, the same sort of, global warming that on Venus has just been taken to an extreme extent is happening on Earth. And he found out, unfortunately, that yes, it is. And so he left his studies of Venus and has been looking at the Earth ever since. One other thing, a couple other things that I wanted to touch on briefly, is planetary protection. This is something that we at NASA take very seriously. We classify our objects of interest, our bodies of interest, if you will. So like, for instance, the moon is classified differently from Mars. We when we go to Mars, we take cleaning the spacecraft very, very seriously. And so that's one way that one thing that we look at that I think is important to consider. And Graham mentioned technology transfer. This has been a big interest of mine my entire career. When I was at NASA headquarters a number of years ago, I sponsored a study that in one very narrow area showed that the economic return from only 15 companies that had spawned from NASA's life sciences research had given back 10 times the value of the entire NASA investment in its history. And so that's pretty staggering when you think about it. And so just looking at dollars alone, the value is huge. But then there's all of the capabilities that Graham mentioned as well. So these are profound topics to think about.
Well, I mean, I just like to say, it's not that I disagree with anything you guys said exactly, but I do. One of my pet peeves is that people oftentimes are very careless about the sort of concepts that they import and the sort of analogies that they make. I'm reminded of a quote by Mark Twain, who said that a cat who sits on a hot stove will never sit on a hot stove again, but it will also never sit on a cold stove. So, when people talk about the evils of colonization, I'm not defending colonization, but I immediately want to say, is that the right analogy here? Because we have zero evidence that there's anything like people out in space. And the basic problem with colonization is that we were treating people like objects. So you'd have to convince me first that there are people out there in order for me to really buy that analogy. I'm not sure it does more good than harm. Or even things like pollution. People talk about pollution, but pollution is a concept that we talk about almost all the time on Earth, and everything on Earth is interlaced with life. So you can't really divorce pollution from life in its intuitive sense. And I frankly don't really know what it means to pollute the dark side of the moon. I mean, it's at least an interesting question. Like, if I'm just moving dirt from one pile to another, is that pollution or not? And so I think we need to be very careful, but I also think that being careful means being thoughtful and having people think this kind of thing through in the context of space before we make policies and things like that, because people can confuse themselves as well.
Yeah, I just saw a question come up, which is kind of interesting. It says, assuming that the space, at least in our neighborhood solar system, is pretty much a wasteland, what's the problem with just saying we need to exploit this for the maximum benefit of humankind without a lot of restrictions? That's the question.
Well, I guess I'll go first on this one. I mean, generally speaking, whenever you have a complex debate, the truth is always in the messy middle. That's a
Right.
good sort of critical thinking. So there's someone that says, well, we should just be able to do anything we want to. What I immediately want to ask is, who's the we here?
Yeah.
Because if you're talking about humanity collectively getting together and deciding that X is a good thing, well, okay, maybe. But if you're talking about SpaceX, well, that's a whole nother matter, because SpaceX has got all kinds of motives that may not align with the motives of the United States or the humanity more generally. So I think there's a good argument to be made in sort of a theoretical sense that humans have a moral right to use space resources as long as we do so responsibly. And then there's a huge complicated argument to be had about exactly what constitutes responsible use of resources. But when someone says we should be allowed to do whatever we want, the implication is they don't want any restrictions. And that strikes me as irresponsible.
Yeah. And also, Robert Penn Warren, in his great book, All the King's Men, makes a point. He says, the world is like a major spider web. And when you touch any point of it, whether you intend to or not, it vibrates to the outer perimeters. So the idea that we're all connected, and I think at least maybe for our discussion, we can assume that our solar system is a kind of part of a larger ecosystem for us. I mean, I think as we think about responsibility, we also don't, even though we assume something, we don't know that what we might do, tinkering around might not, in fact, reverberate back to impact, our situation on Earth, whether it be climate or other kind of things.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I wanted to touch on Kelly, your point about colonialism and let you know how I think about it. I think that the chances of us finding intelligent life in our solar system, is probably quite low, right? However, the chance of us finding life in our solar system keeps going up. There was Graham knows more about this than I do, but there was just a discovery this week of phosphorus on Saturn's moon Enceladus, which is a huge interest, for astrobiology, and so the chances of life in the solar system just went up a couple of notches. We haven't ruled it out on Mars either. I remember having discussions 20 years ago about a subsurface hydrosphere on Mars potentially, and that has not been ruled out. And so what I think of, and Kris, what you and I have talked about it at length before, is at what point can we say that Mars is void of life, and we can go there, because I think to do otherwise, to just go without at least a reasonable confidence that there's nothing, there's two dangers. One of which, and I think this is perhaps the more likely one, but who knows? One of which is that the organisms that we carry with us, and there's far more cells of other things within and on us than there are human cells, the organisms that we carry with us could wipe out an entire biosphere. To me, that would be a sin beyond measure, akin to the things that we did in the colonial past. But of course, there's the other, flip issue, and that's that maybe those organisms, those putative organisms on Mars, could find us interesting and tasty and whatever, and we could have an Andromeda strain situation. And NASA has taken that possibility very seriously for many years too. So to me, that's my expanded view, if you will, of colonialism. And Graham, I'd be interested in your thoughts on that as well, since you're a real practicing astrobiologist.
I'll admit, I was thinking of the same thing of Mars, and the famous quote from Carl Sagan that if there are bacteria or things on Mars, that we should leave Mars to the Martians, and that's a big question. Some of us, though, we wonder, could we even find signs of life on Mars without sending humans? Maybe that is a necessary step for us to get there. Of course, we currently have Perseverance, a remarkable robot on Mars collecting samples that are being cached. We're going to have this very large infrastructure built with cooperation with the European Space Agency and NASA to send a mission, collect those samples, bring them back to Earth. But even then, maybe Jezero Crater doesn't have any signs of past or present life on Mars. Maybe there are no signs of life at the surface of Mars that a rover can easily access. Maybe we need humans to go. There's a paper that hasn't been published, so I don't want to say too much, but a bright young student named Jennifer Keith has done an analysis of leakage rates from the ISS and submarines and other kind of environments like that, controlled environments, and trying to question, when we do send humans to Mars, what will be the leakage rate of bacteria and like our biome, basically our microbiome, leaving the habitat and going out across Mars and, you know, spreading in the sandstorms and blowing across the surface of Mars. And, you know, she hasn't published yet, but it does happen pretty fast. And other folks have looked at this too. Once we send humans, we might start obscuring signs of possible Martian life. And so there's a whole lot of trade-offs here. It's part of the reason why we do have to have like philosophy and humanities involved in these larger conversations about, you know, not just can we go to Mars, but should we go to Mars, and what do we do then?
Yeah, one of the questions I just saw, and again, those of you who are interested in the audience asking questions, please feel free to go ahead and put those on the chat function. Somebody mentioned, what do we mean by intelligent life? Going back, our perception quote of life, maybe just in general, and maybe intelligent life, has certainly changed on Earth over the past millennia and a couple of hundred years. But also, given that, I want to go back to something we've just alluded to, because I think it's an interesting question that, again, Carl Sagan also alluded to. What is our responsibility if we go to Mars? Or maybe it's not Mars. Maybe it's it's the moon of Mars. We don't know. It could be any of the celestial bodies out there. And we, in fact, find evidence of primitive life. I don't care how primitive it is, that exist currently. If we find that it has exist, but it done anymore, that's all sorts of other issues. But what, we in our intro, we talked about, are we custodians of this? Are we just, this belongs to us? But from a moral, ethical, philosophical, and even technological standpoint, because we don't know what the implications are. What do we do? Just real quick, I don't think any of us think it's beyond the realm of possibility, without pointing fingers, that a private company would say, wow, I can make money off this.
Yeah, technology development could happen from finding alien life. That's certainly a possibility. We've explored that in lots of science fiction and movies and video games and all kinds of things where the evil corporation uses the alien to try to create some new bioweapon or something like that. And so maybe Greg and Kelly can speak more to the philosophical, moral concerns here. I will say, for me as an astrobiologist, and just as someone who wants to know where we've come from, the questions of astrobiology, of trying to understand life, they're the grand questions that humans have been asking ourselves for millennia. Where do we come from? Why are we here? Is there something more out there than just us? And so these are kind of, the unfolding questions of trying to understand life, intelligence, consciousness. If we find alien life, no matter how primitive that might seem on Mars, that life gives us a chance to start doing some comparative biology. And that is incredible. If that life has DNA, RNA, proteins like we do, if it has a similar genetic code like we do, that might tell us almost immediately that it has a shared ancestry, a shared origin. That might mean that either it came to Mars from Earth, or it might mean that we're Martians, that maybe life started on Mars and came to Earth, or maybe it started on Venus and then, splattered out across the solar system. Or we might find that life is remarkably different. Maybe it has a different information system, different approaches to metabolism, to having cellular encapsulation or no encapsulation. There's a lot of possibilities that we've considered for possible alien life out there. And if we find that would give us even more to explore. When you look at phylogenetic trees, you need an outlier. When you start comparing organisms to each other, if you have a bunch of the same kind of similar organisms, you can't really say much. But if you have an outlier, a different organism, it tells you a lot about how those things are all connected. And if we have a shared ancestry or a different ancestry, there's so much science, so much cool research we can get from that.
Well, I'll say a word or two here. The question originally was sort of like, what is life and what is intelligent life? Those are very complicated questions. As someone who's tried to answer the what is life question, it's a lot easier to say what it's not than to say what it is. And there are all kinds of reasons for that. And intelligence is not a whole lot easier to deal with. But I think what we owe ourselves is we have to be as careful as we can in coming up with definitions that don't seem to be biased in obvious ways. We can make mistakes, but all we can do is the best we can. I will say this though, a lot of times people talk as if there is life out there, then that sort of answers the question about our moral responsibility. And I would say, no, that starts the conversation. So people generally think that life has special moral status, right? But it's not true that all life is equally valuable, or at least very few people take that position. So, sometimes when people say, well, if there's life on Mars, we should leave Mars alone, like Carl Sagan did. I think that's absurd. I think that's actually an immoral argument on its face. Because, the fact that something's alive is only a very small part of the discussion about what our moral responsibilities are towards it. And the practical sort of application of this is I teach intro to ethics all the time. And we talk about abortion, and students will always say, well, the embryo is alive. And I say, you're absolutely right. The embryo is alive, but so are skin cells that I just sloughed off my fingertips. And we don't think that those have moral value in the same way that a human being does. So yes, they're alive, and that opens the door to a conversation, but it doesn't settle the moral value, right? We kill things all the time for our own benefit, right? That's how humans.
Yeah.
Sure. I would add that in my view, I think that this would be a very unique thing. One of the biggest discoveries for humanity ever, right? Discovering life. And for us at NASA, I reflect, I was privileged to be amongst the group that started astrobiology a quarter century ago. It was a very small number of us that were working in it. It has expanded to be something. There are programs in astrobiology all around the world, investigators, in so many different countries, and for NASA, for the agency that I work with, it is one of the most central questions. It has been elevated to to a high level in our strategic plan, and so I would say that a perspective that I have is if I look into the future, we will be judged. Humanity will be judged by how we treat this life that we will eventually discover, and we will eventually discover it. Some, like Seth Shostak at the SETI Institute, think it's going to be within 20 years or perhaps less. And I might, given all the discoveries, like I was talking about, like we've all been talking about here, I would be inclined to agree. I think for the younger folks listening right now, this is probably going to happen in your lifetime. One thing I want to reflect on here that's just so incredibly exciting is that I chaired an astrobiology session at a conference just a few months ago, and Natalie Battaglia, who is one of the preeminent exoplanet scientists in the world, she's at UC Santa Cruz, close to here in California, and she showed one of her slides was on a spectrum that was taken with the new James Webb Space Telescope of the atmosphere of an exoplanet. And I'd heard about this, I hadn't seen this yet, but what she's showing is chemicals, that are in this atmosphere of a planet that is many light years away. We now have that capability. And so we will be able to see signatures, that are going to be perhaps indicative of life and perhaps only could be created by life. And there could as well be what we call techno-signatures, where we're actually discovering things that could only be produced by a civilization on that planet. So we're a heck of a lot closer than a lot of us think to really having to wrestle with these kind of decisions and thoughts.
It may have been an article that Kelly drafted, but I'm not sure. But anyway, where it said, that the indigenous populations, when they explored, they talked about, we talk about rights, they talked about obligations. And so I do think that somebody asked, well, how are we going to inform whether it's countries, companies, et cetera, on how we, our responsibility here. I mean, it gets back to Kishin of, we can talk about what we want, but there's issues of governance and things like that.
I think it's very important that we get a diverse group of people that have the right expertise and the right connections, right?
Right.
I mean, I'm a philosopher, so I sit around and think in a dark room about the nature of goodness and moral behavior. I don't do politics. I don't try to figure out how to get people to do what I think they should be doing. But there are people that do that. And that's one of the things I think needs to change right now, is that, for a long time, the space agencies have been doing this, and that makes sense. But they, to some extent, they have a monopoly on this, at least in terms of the actual money and that kind of stuff. And there are all kinds of issues that scientists just aren't really trained to think through in the right kind of way. Now, the flip side of that is that a lot of people on my side of the fence don't understand the science, which is also a problem. So what we really need to do is to get a more diverse community to really engage with these issues before we start setting precedents. Because once SpaceX goes out there and starts doing X, then that takes on inertia, and it's much more difficult to change it than it is to pass regulations before it happens in the first place. So we're kind of at a critical phase, I think, in sort of future of humanity in space. It's like, this is the time to be thinking seriously, because we can't actually put a self-sustaining colony on Mars right now. We're maybe close to it, but we can't do it yet. So now's the time to think.
Right. And I think one of the things I agree, and one of the I guess precepts of humanity in deep space in our first first event that we had and other things is that opening kickoff event a couple of years ago, we had people who trained scientists, we had senior NASA officials, we had philosophers, we had chefs, we had poets, we had musicians, and the idea, again, to your point, was there's no such thing as useless knowledge, I always like to say. And it was to bring all of these different perspectives together, many of which had never really thought about what they do in relation to space. But they all had interesting insights when asked that question. Well, how, what do you think? How do you contribute as a chef, as a poet? I can't remember who was the astronaut supposedly who said originally that, they should have sent a poet when he was up. Who was that? Well, you guys probably know. Who, Graham, would you know that? Who was that?
I'm actually not sure. I've heard that from Contact, Carl Sagan.
Oh, yeah, maybe that's what it is.
Yeah,
maybe
sure,
it's just,
right?
I don't know if it's true or not.
But
Hey,
the sentiment, though, has been repeated by many astronauts
Yeah.
through time that we do need people who have a background in other pursuits of humanity. I will say from my part, absolutely, yes, we need to have the diverse conversation. There's so much knowledge, so much cultivated knowledge and creativity amongst the human population of 8 billion people on this planet, and yet not even 700 people have gone to space yet. And so we do have a limit of who's gone to space, who's seen the Earth from the outside, who's shared the messages. But when it comes to space law and space philosophy, we need to be having those conversations. And I feel like a lot of these webinars we do, these panels, we always say the same things, like we need to have the conversation, but then how do we actually make it happen? And we see this across the board with common human pursuits right now with AI development. I signed on to that letter that Max Tegmark, Mark, and others wrote saying we should put a pause on development of AI stronger than GPT 4.0. I agree with many who had arguments against it, but there are reasons that we need to have the conversation, the philosophical and legal conversation right now about the implications of that. And that's just a few years. It's been a few decades that we've had, machine learning processes and this kind of programming that's gone into what we're now seeing with large language models and things like that. For space, I mean, it's not even been 7 decades since we sent the first thing into space. I mean, we are very new at space exploration as a species. There's a lot more that's going to happen, and it's going to happen very quickly. And so we need to have those conversations, not just amongst all of us who are interested, but for everyone across.
Real quickly to the point you just made, I think it's interesting. And the other thing that seems to happen, of course, again, a lot of it is because, I reside in this country, is most of the conversations predominantly talk about philosophy from Western civilization standpoint. There's all sorts of different viewpoints and ideas and philosophies out there in the world that have very, very, very different perspectives than we might have.
Yeah, that's right. That's absolutely. And that, returning to, the point that Kelly brought up and Graham underscored, I so agree with this. We need to have this conversation. What it reminds me of is something that happened in the early 1970s when Stan Cohen and Herb Boyer, of Stanford and UCSF respectively, discovered the original gene splicing tools. And they realized that there were big ethical and moral implications with this. And so they said, we need to get together, and come up with our own internal rule set that governs how we do this work, or else what's going to happen is others who don't know about it are going to come up with rules for us, right? And so I think that we're in the same kind of situation now, 50 years later, with regards to life. We need to have thoughts about it, and we need to, like both of these gentlemen have been saying, we need to bring in a diverse set of ideas that's going to represent all of humanity, because it's really that profound what we're doing.
So how do we, and again, I'm going to go back to what Kelly and Graham and you said. So how do we, and I know there's no answer, I mean, how do we do that? I mean, we haven't been able to do it since the beginning of humankind.
Edgar Mitchell had a cool idea for that.
All right.
From the view from the moon. So there's a famous quote from Edgar Mitchell, looking back at the Earth from the view from the moon,
right?
That seeing the Earth from that vantage point makes you want to grab a politician by the scruff of their neck, drag them 1,000 miles out there, make them look at the Earth and say, "Look at that, you son of a bitch!" Like, look at what's going on here, and think about the larger implications of law. One thing that we need with long-term thinking, and we really need long-term thinking in our societies now more than ever. We need to kind of look back to some indigenous thoughts on that too, for like 7th generation thinking forward to how those who come after us inherit what we leave behind. Right now, a lot of our politicians, they only care about the next election cycle, or the next year or two ahead. They're not thinking on the long term for what happens to our children, our grandchildren, not just in space exploration, but all realms of law.
Right.
We need to enact longer term thinking. We need to build structures in our civilizations that enact longer term thinking in how we address law.
We had a, go ahead, Kelly, I'm sorry.
The problem is that's a general problem, right? That's not just politics. I mean, that's a general problem. But, as I tell my students, it's rarely the case that someone does something immoral because they're evil, right? Like people that do bad things, they're not like the evil guy on a James Bond movie. They're usually people that are more or less, they think they're doing okay. And usually the problem is they just haven't thought it through very carefully, right? People don't like to think. They don't like to think about complicated things. And one of the ways that this gets really problematic, I just got back from a conference at NASA where they wanted to have the mission directorates and a whole bunch of people like me come in and talk about social and ethical issues. And I was happy to do that. But I'm not sure it's going to produce much because, it's pretty clear that NASA is a government agency, and they have a very specific mandate to work on very specific things, and they only have so much latitude. And there's just no budget item for social and ethical musings. There's nothing like that. So they can do things here and there, but there's no directorate, there's no ethicist in residence, none of that. And that's because Congress didn't ask for that. And so, now you're asking, well, how do I convince Congress to rewrite I have no idea. That's why I want to talk to some social scientists and sort of go, hey, are there clever ways to do this? Like, how do we accomplish this?
But I think I'm correct in reading at one point where Elon Musk made a comment that there are no rules on Mars. So even if you get, again, this is unanswerable, it's a kind of a really existential question. And that is, how do we can talk about it, but I don't, how do we try to lay a path where people actually adhere about it other than command and control? There was an article that came out not too long ago. It said, can we own Mars? And I talked to a lot of people about that, and several people said, well, no, the answer was, no, we have the Outer Space Treaty in 1967 says, they're signed by 190 whatever it says we can own Mars. And I get that, but I also look back historically and I think, the only treaty, ultimately almost all treaties, if not all of them, ultimately are abided by because somebody had a bigger gun, not because somebody signed a letter saying, oh yeah, I'm not going to do this. So I think it is a really existential question, which brings me back to another thing we talked about just before we went on live. And I know this is hard, but it's an interesting question. Are we as humans, given human nature and our, evolutionary cycle, are we capable of this? I mean, it's one thing to say we should do it, but are we, are we, as if you look at human nature, going back thousands of years, have we demonstrated that other than small examples or small groups of people that we are actually capable of this?
Capable
of responsible, actually using ethics as a guide of doing the kinds of thinking about and doing the kinds of things that we do, not going into another celestial body and just saying, let's dig it up and mine it for whatever, regardless, because I think historically that's been, unfortunately, that's been the experience. And so I think it does get, I think it does get back a little bit to kind of our genetic makeup and the psychology of humans and other kinds of things and evolution of, are we at that point where this is even remotely possible? Well, as a group.
I'll start, and throw out an answer, like Kelly said about himself, I'm an optimist, and so I'm going to say, yes, we are capable. That's a different question of whether we will do that.
Right.
If left to our own devices, economics is almost always the driver. And people wanting to make money, people wanting to make a living and whatnot. But I also think that under the right circumstances, we can be very ethical. And I am not at all defending our actions of the past. Humanity has done some pretty awful things. We've also done some wonderful things too. And so I think that what we need to do is look at this problem in the right context, and so again, going back to the discovery of life, which I'm quite sure is going to happen in one way or another, in our collective lifetimes, we have to think about the profoundness of that question, about what life is, not just on a chemical, sort of basis or physical basis, but what it is on a spiritual sort of basis. What does it mean that something is alive? And I am a self-admitted Trekkie, and I think that something akin to the prime directive, is not precisely perhaps, is something that we should think about pretty deeply, So, my personal opinion is the destruction of a biosphere would be, like I said earlier, would be a terrible, terrible sin, akin to some of the worst things that humanity has ever done. I don't know if there's a consensus on that. I think that we need to get people together, people of all stripes, you know, in all different fields and from the entire globe, to have that conversation together.
Yeah, I think, you know, it's fashionable, particularly amongst ethicists, you know, that this is what we get paid for, is to find problems. So it's fashionable to point out all the problems and all the ways in which something can go horribly, horribly wrong. And that's a valuable exercise. But I always like to point out the reason we know that human beings so often do horrible things is because we can think about them and recognize that they're horrible things, which means that we also have the potential to do things correctly, right? And one can debate how often this happens, but you know, whenever someone starts painting a dark picture of what the future in space is going to be like, I always want to say, I'm not saying you might not be right. I'm just saying, what's your evidence? Like, why are you so convinced that it'll turn out bad instead of turning out good? And don't you think there are things we could do that would make the difference between those two? One of my colleagues wrote an interesting article where he sort of took on this indirectly. He said, what if we could send a ship to another world and it would colonize another world, right? But it was so far away from Earth that we would have no contact with this world. The catch is the ship can only be inhabited by the worst possible human beings that you can find. It's just the dregs of humanity, right? An optimist like me, I tend to think of that like, well, okay, the mission may fail because they kill each other or whatever. And if it doesn't fail, it's going to be pretty bad for a while. But I'm pretty confident if you came back to that world in 200 or 300 years, it's not going to be that different from Earth, right? Like, people are people, and even the scuzzy ones have normal kids, right? So
That paints an interesting example with Australia, though. So, I mean, in Australia, obviously, we did have the issue of indigenous people already existing on the land, but it was used by European nations as a penal colony. And so the worst people, or arguably, you know, for their given time, morally the worst people were sent there. And we've seen that in science fiction as well. You know, using a
Didn't Robert Heinlein write a book about that, about the moon being basically end up being a penal colony?
Yeah. But I love that idea, though. Yeah, what would happen over time? Would they get better? I will say, back to Greg's concept here with the Prime Directive from Star Trek. One of the more interesting things about that Prime Directive is that the more enjoyable human stories that relate to the Prime Directive are always, why do we not follow the Prime Directive? Why do we break the Prime Directive? It's just like you know, in AI and machine learning and things like that. Isaac Asimov wrote his robot laws. I have this argument with people all the time, like, oh, well, we can just use the robot laws from Isaac Asimov for AI, and that'll help us. The whole purpose of the robot laws and iRobot, all the books, the whole purpose is that they create problems more than they create solutions. And so I think when it comes to planning for the future, we need to do our best, knowing that sometimes we will make mistakes, sometimes we'll fail. But then, Kris, back to your original question, you know, what have we done in the past? Certainly, we've done some remarkable things that have allowed for our civilizations to persist for so long, that have allowed us, you know, in the modern day, many people around the planet, not everyone, and we should always acknowledge that, but many people have access to clean water, to stable food sources, to electricity. A lot of us in more technological nations, we have access to the internet. We're connecting across the planet. You know, I've in the past week, since I have a lot of interns working for me, I've been speaking to people all around the world about research and doing things together. But one of my favorite examples of us, and a single concrete example, is the Montreal Protocol. You know, people had realized, like, we were doing something bad. We were putting CFCs, these chlorofluorocarbons, into our atmosphere. Science told us, we had observational science from satellites from space looking at the Earth, and we saw this hole forming in the ozone layer, and we're like, oh my gosh, the science tells us that's a bad thing. It's going to be a detriment to future people, not to us. And so, and I was a baby. I was a toddler when this happened. So I'm saying us more, in the people who were leaders of our world at that point in time made a decision to ban chlorofluorocarbons from use in most domestic products. And that made a huge difference. And so we have examples. That is one specific example. And certainly we could spend an hour or more just going through examples we can think off the top of our heads of times in history when humans have done things thinking forward.
I'm we've had a number of questions. I want to go back to before we're almost, not quite, but almost out of time. I have a question I want to pose to everybody because I think it's interesting. Several of the questions have, again, kind of alluded to the fact that, as you see, how do we do this? And we've, doing this right. And actually quite positive, talking about terraforming Mars and how do we do this? And, can we do this? Should we even try? For those of you who are interested in following up, I would encourage you to go ahead and send humanityindeepspace.com your question. You can send it to me at kkimmel@humanityindeepspace.com, and I will try to get some answers back to you. Oftentimes we do that because we won't be able to get to all of them, but there's some really interesting questions. And for couple of people have asked, well, how do from different perspectives, how do we get people involved? How can I get involved? I'm certainly willing to talk to Kelly and Greg and Graham and others and figure out ways of plugging people in that are generally, really interested in this. And certainly Humanity in Deep Space, we're actually thinking about another live event based around this very concept, again, where a lot of people from different disciplines will come together. But having said that, in the few minutes we have left, I want to ask the view on a really interesting concept that I've always found fascinating, called the Great Filter. And the question, we always talk about how wonderful it is, but as we know, there's a train of thought out there among certain scientists, exoplanet experts and others, talking about the Great Filter, and that if we find either extant life, like that may not be necessarily a good thing for human civilization. And I'm gonna let you guys talk about that.
Well, first off, so the filter, there could be many filters.
Right.
That could, be a good or a bad thing. And so even thinking about this idea that there's a filtering effect that can dwindle us down or destroy us,
right.
There's a lot of things that could be existential threats. So it's not just necessarily finding alien life. It could be bombardment from space by a planetary impactor. It could be our use of nuclear weapons on this planet. Honestly, I grew up, the Cold War was still going on when I was a very young child. But we had all kinds of movies and stuff in the 90s and the late 80s where it was exploring like what happens if we destroy ourselves. I feel like we're closer to that now than we ever were when I was a child, given where geopolitical issues are right now on our planet. And one thing I love, so earlier Greg mentioned the Drake equation. When Frank Drake created that equation in 1960, it was never intended to be like the back of the math book, here's the answer to the problem. It's a thought experiment about what we know and what we don't know. And my favorite part of the equation is the final filter of the equation. It's the L factor at the very end. It tells us that there is a longevity to civilizations, or there could be a longevity to civilizations. And in 1960, that was a very poignant time to say, oh my gosh, we are testing nuclear weapons around the world. We've used 2 of them to eradicate a large number of people already. What is the potential for us to end our own civilization, to filter ourselves out of existence as a living species by doing this? And so
I just want to add one more quick thing just to clarify a little bit. And again, this is not the only thing that, one of the thoughts is that perhaps one of the reasons we haven't encountered intelligent life anywhere is the fact of this notion, one aspect of the Great Filter, and that advanced civilizations don't survive long enough to actually get to a point where we can communicate with them, and vice versa, and why that is. So if we find evidence of life, whether it's extant or extinct, the probability of life in the universe, it goes up exponentially. And I think, it just changes the probability completely. And so that suggests that maybe lends credence to the fact that there's something that happens, whatever it might be, that keeps civilizations from surviving long enough to do this. So
I think the Great Filter is a lot of fun to think about. Like the Fermi paradox and the Drake equation is great fun, great armchair philosophy or biology or whatever you want to call it. But I think what motivates the Great Filter is basically how come we haven't made contact with aliens. Right. And I don't think that tells us very much right now, because we haven't left the solar system. At least humans haven't. We've sent an object outside, just barely outside the solar system. So we know so little about what's out there, not to mention if there are intelligent aliens capable of communicating with us. We know nothing about their psychology or their culture or like why they might not want to. So I think it's premature to invest a lot of fear in the Great Filter. Yeah, it's possible, sure. But, I'm not going to worry about that any more than I'm going to worry about some hypothetical problem that, physicists don't think is real having to do with some nuclear reactor. It's like, yeah, maybe, but first I have to be convinced there's a problem that needs solution.
Right. Yeah, somebody mentioned one of the people, which is true. Somebody mentioned earlier in one of the questions, we don't even know if we could even recognize it. I mean, if we found life, there's no guarantee that our sensory systems, our brains could even recognize it.
Sure. And we're also, I was just reading our article about this just the other day. We're also just on the edge of these civilizations having, recognizing that we are a technological civilization. And so if we think we've been broadcasting radio signals for on the order of 100 years, something like that. And what that means is that, within a radius of 100 light years, those civilizations that are within that might be able to detect us if they're looking in the right way, if they have sensitive enough equipment, et cetera, and if they can make meaning out of what we're saying, much less actually sending something back. So if you think about that, to actually have been able to send something back, you'd have to have something within a radius of 50 light years.
Right.
And they would have to have sent something back immediately. And so so because of that alone, I think it's entirely reasonable to think, I'm not surprised at all why we haven't been communicated to, if you will. And then plus, we've only been looking with serious technology for a very short amount of time. I brought up the SETI Institute earlier. I know those folks very well, and they have the Allen Telescope Array, which is still under construction, but that was originally financed by Paul Allen of Microsoft, and so so they've really just started in looking.
Yeah, and as somebody mentioned earlier, we live in a gigantic universe, maybe infinite, and there's also this distinct possibility that there's life out there that we will never ever find out about, just because of the enormous time and space that exists there. Unfortunately, we're out of time. Listen, this has really been a lot of fun. For those of you who know, we do record these, and in a week or so, it will be available on our website, on our YouTube page, and so you can chime into that. I want to also just thank again our sponsors, Space 629, the SSERVI Institute at NASA that Greg heads up, KSTC, the Kentucky Science Technology Corporation, National Stem Cell Foundation, Sjogren Center, Baird Financial, Space Tango, Commercial Space Company, Media Collaboratory, the START program at UK, STEM program, Higher Orbits, the Interstellar Foundation, Visit Lex, and 22 Solutions, again, for making all of this possible and allowing us to offer these conversations for free, which is important. We want to make them accessible. So I want to thank Graham, Kelly, and Greg. It's been really a lot of fun. Great. Thanks for your time. And thank all of you. And we'll see you next time.
Thanks, everyone.
Well,
Thank you for joining us for Humanity in Deep Space. You can find all of our videos, as well as other curated content, at www.humanityindeepspace.com or on YouTube by joining Humanity in Deep Space. The music for this episode of Humanity in Deep Space was written and performed by Danny Grandstaff and is available at dannygrandstaff.bandcamp.com.